Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking about one of our favorite topics, ethical villainy. And I'm joined by my host, Riki Hayashi of the Star Wars Universe podcast. All that and more right after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back, everyone. Today we have something I'm really excited about. Any of you who are also listeners to the Star Wars Universe podcast will have gotten to know Riki. Riki's a good friend and colleague of mine from the Judge world, who has been a host with, along with his partner Sarah, on the Star Wars Universe podcast. And today he's joining us over here to talk about something he and I have discussed a good deal, and that we touch on a lot in this show, but haven't really gotten to dive deep into in quite a while. And namely, it's the topic of ethical villainy. Riki, do you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about this topic is your suggestion? Tell us a little about kind of what you have in mind and what makes you interested in this.
Yeah, hello. Good evening, Matthew, and to all the listeners. So, for me, this has always been a very interesting topic. Villains in comics, comic books, movies, etc. have always appealed to me a bit more than the heroes. They've been more interesting characters to me. Yeah. And especially like my focus, I think, for this one, we'll talk about a wide range of villains, but my focus is really going to be on Sinestro, who is the arch nemesis of the Green Lanterns, specifically Green Lantern Hal Jordan. And so, like, from that, we've been talking about this topic for a while, and from that, I thought there were a lot of interesting questions about whether villains can be ethical, right? Like, villains are supposed to be evil, like it's good versus evil. So what does it mean to be an ethical villain? Like, what are the ethics of villainy? Why do they do the things they do? What are their motivations? I think that can really define and set them apart from other types of villains. So that's my main interest here. Nice.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I always think of when I think of the ethical villain is the person who, from their own point of view, they 100% think they're the good guy in the story, or the good person in the story, and that often it's because of either they have a flawed logic, or sometimes it's just that they don't have information and they're ignorant, or that they're kind of blinded by biases or whatever it might be, and so we, the audience, might see things differently, and certainly the hero, quote unquote, sees things differently, but I share that same interest for you, and for me, it's always that idea of the villain who thinks they're the one in the right. Does that track for you? That the ones you think of are ones who wouldn't necessarily see themselves as the villain in the story?
Well, no one sees themselves as the villain of the story, right? That's kind of the how the saying goes. For me,
I mean, I think if you're robbing a bank, you're pretty sure that you're on the robbers' side of cops and robbers. You might think there's nothing wrong with that, but you certainly think that you're going against the law in a way that I feel like ethical villainy is not quite that.
Well, even in something as simple as robbing a bank. I mean, we talk about, for example, capitalism, right? The evils of capitalism as a system and how it's set up. And maybe the bank robber thinks that, like Robin Hood, in fact, it is technically a villain, right? Like he steals money. And yet we all think of Robin Hood as a hero. So there you go.
I mean, do you think someone like Emperor Palpatine thinks of themselves as much of a good guy as Magneto does?
So, I mean, Palpatine, I love Star Wars, obviously. I'm on a podcast about it with you. But Palpatine is probably one of the shallowest and one-dimensional villains in all of canon. Like, he's an amazing character in terms of the actor and the life he brings to it, and of course, like, his powers, the Force lightning. The first time you see that, it is just amazing.
Right.
But what is this guy doing? Why is he doing these things? Right. And so, like, we can talk a little bit about that and how he fits into this kind of hierarchy of villains, I guess.
No, that's fair, and I guess I'm just trying to establish the framework that I'm using, but I can understand it for you. You see it kind of differently. So I guess then, if you don't go with that idea, how would you define what is an ethical villain as opposed to The mustache twirler is kind of, I think, the phrase we often use here instead. But how would you kind of define what's your idea of an ethical villain?
So when I look at villains, specifically, like mostly I think of comic books, right? Like that's kind of the classic place where we have these good versus evil battles. I broke it down into 4 archetypes that could maybe be 3. So the first archetype of villain is the criminal. Just the person who is breaking the law, often is stealing things, right? Like this was like the original, Action Comics, Batman and Superman Detective Comics. Their nemesis were people who were committing crimes and often just like stealing things.
People often forget, I think, that DC it stands for Detective Comics, and it was very much about Batman as a detective more than anything.
Yeah, and then like the Batman TV series, all of the villains, all they did was like steal things, rob banks or steal paintings or whatever their theme was, right? Like Catwoman would steal cat-themed artwork or whatever. So yeah, that's one category of villainy, and again, like we can look at that as saying like stealing things is bad, except for Robin Hood. So there's like there are question marks there,
right?
The second kind of overarching category of villains I came up with was the killer. Literally just people who go out and kill, whether it is murdering individuals or committing larger scale genocide killings. And you could see this as an outgrowth of the criminal in the quote at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy, right? Like murder is one of the worst crimes,
right?
So here's someone who was not just breaking the laws of society, but really going against the laws of nature by killing.
Right.
And so like the most simple version of this would be the Joker. A modern day Joker. Like I think Joker also originally was just a thief. But today we think of Joker as a murderer who just delights in killing people in weird chemical fashion. And then on the larger scale, we just had Thanos in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, who literally erased half of all life in the universe with a snap.
Right.
So those are the two kind of extremes of the killer as a villain. And I think Thanos is actually... They made Thanos more interesting in the movies than I was expecting. Because, I mean, what his motivation is in the comics, right?
Right. In the comics, and it's funny because the movies teased this a little bit. In the comics, he's literally wiping out half the universe to flirt. He has a huge crush on Death, who is the embodiment of death itself.
Yeah, Death is a character and is a woman.
Right. And his idea is that by killing, and it's important, he's not removing them from existence, he's killing half the people in the universe. That's a meet cute in his mind. To me, the shift towards what he does instead is something I think is really emblematic of, and we'll talk about this, that it seems we're getting a lot more of that kind of ethical villain because to me here, Thanos, and this is kind of what I was getting at, Thanos does it in the movies now because he believes that he's actually helping, that he's doing good in some way.
It's an economic argument.
Yeah,
like we are currently right now, April of 2020, we are seeing people make very similar arguments about the coronavirus situation. Like it's okay if a few more people die in order to open up the economy. Like that, they're making that kind of, they're weighing life versus, I guess, a way of life.
I mean, in a strictly to look at it from a perspective of the academic, moral, and ethical world, his argument is 100% based in utilitarianism, and it's also based in faulty logic and understanding of economics. But even if his central conceit was true, I think from the school of utilitarianism, his argument makes sense. I think most of us would then look at him and go, "Yeah, but that's a perfect example of what's wrong with the school of utilitarianism."
Right. But his argument is that the quality of life for the remaining half the people or life forms will be improved.
Right. And I guess that to me is what I think of when I think of the ethical villain. It's especially because, like with someone Thanos, it's pretty easy to say, okay, no, clearly you're wrong. But but there's a moment where you go, maybe he has a point. I'm interested in thinking about this. And what I think of the ethical villain more than anything is it is those villains who make me do that. When Magneto makes me think, wait a minute, when I think about mutants or any, minority that is abused and people are scared of, like, is there some sense to fighting back in the way Magneto talks about, or the kind of arguments Killmonger makes, or someone like that.
Yeah.
Those are the ones that I think I like most.
So we'll get to them. Let me move on here though to the third category of villains that I came up with, which is the Conqueror. These are the villains that are, quote, trying to take over the world or the galaxy or the multiverse or whatever. So you have, kind of human characters like Maxwell Lord from DC and Lex Luthor also from DC, who are humans trying to conquer planet Earth or the country or whatever. You have from Marvel, Doctor Doom, right? Is essentially a conqueror, although he kind of starts out already as the king of Latveria, but he's trying to maintain that.
Right.
And then, like, on the cosmic scale, I thought of Darkseid, who is what are those planets called? He is trying to take over New Genesis. Is that what it is?
I don't. You know the comics much better than I do, so I'll trust you on that one.
And I guess in the DC movies, he's also trying to conquer Earth now, which he does in the comics too. So yeah, like these are people who I don't know. Like, I don't know how ethical these conquerors are, right? Because they mostly seem like they are very ego driven,
right?
I guess like Luthor is probably the most ethical in a sense, in that he thinks he's so smart, he knows better, and that people's quality of life again would be better under his quote unquote rule when he becomes president. And
there is that kind of what I often refer to as intellectual fascism of and it's in science fiction literature especially, it was a very prevalent idea, especially I think of Robert Heinlein's ideas often going to this. But it's the idea of, like, we are the smart people, everyone else is stupid and is making bad decisions, we should just take over because we know best and we can best create an ethical society for everyone. And generally I think you're supposed to look at it and go, well, wait a minute, that's a really, really bad idea. Because of our concept of freedom.
Yes.
But I think some of the ones that I think are most interesting is is when it's a little bit of a question. Have you seen the TV show Supergirl?
Oh yeah. So I'm not caught up on it. I believe we watched the first 3 seasons. Okay.
I'm trying to remember the name of the character, but in the first season of Supergirl, the big bad winds up being I think she's a fellow Kryptonian, but I think she's actually like Kara-El's aunt or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Listeners, please correct me. But her concept is that humans are destroying the planet. So she wants to completely mind control every person on the planet.
Yes.
To force them to completely rebuild industry to make it green and save the planet and end the threat of climate change. And then she'll return control. And we actually did a whole episode early on this show about, is she right?
Oh, like, nice.
Because yeah, to me, I'm guessing this is the kind of thing you mean. That's to me a great example of one where, like, I hate the idea of someone else taking control. I don't want to give up freedom like that. But the idea that we're all as humans using our freedom badly and destroying the planet is completely correct. And frankly, if you told me that tomorrow someone was going to take everything over and force climate change upon us, I feel like I'm supposed to think that's a bad idea. And I think it's a bad idea, but I'm really not sure, And to me, that's the kind of thing you look at the villain and you go, yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from.
Well, yeah. Like, so the first two categories, the criminal and the killer, like it's very easy to see where the lines are
Right.
between quote unquote good and evil. Whereas once you start getting into these upper categories, I think there are question marks.
Right.
And certainly, like, when it comes to the conqueror archetype, which you just said, freedom, right? Like free will versus actually like law. Like, so the conquerors are trying to take over and create new laws in their own image. And then the heroes who are fighting against them are actually arguing against what are now the laws and arguing for free will. And so the situations like in Marvel, when they have the civil wars, not when they disagree over, although the movie kind of touched on this, like I think the comic book civil wars did a much better job of having this conflict between freedom and how much authority can control things.
Right. Yeah, and I think those are all interesting questions because it gets into, I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot in terms of these stories, and this is a little bit meta, but it's also a question of who's telling the story. Killmonger is one of my favorite villains in part because I feel like the movie called Black Panther, of course Black Panther becomes the hero of that. And the way that story is told from Black Panther's perspective, I think I wind up siding with Black Panther. But I'm fairly certain that if you made a movie called Killmonger, in which Killmonger was portrayed as the hero, and the two of them had the exact same motivations and the exact same methods, I think I'm probably still going to be somewhat judgmental of Eric's methods. But I think even from this movie, I'm really on the fence about him, and I think I'd be a lot more on it if it's told from another perspective. So I think it's one thing to think about as we go through these is who's telling the story? Because, with a lot of these, I often sort of wonder, like, what would the story, what would an X-Men story look like if Magneto was the point of view character instead of Professor X? As just one example.
So I agree with a lot of what you just said. I would just want to add that Killmonger needs better PR. He needs a better name.
Yes.
Because when you put kill in your name, it's like, maybe we shouldn't trust you.
Yeah.
So this brings us to my fourth category, which I think could be a subcategory of the Conqueror, but I call it the politician, which is that these are villains who are, again, like trying to impose their will or their ideas of what a society should be on people. And in some cases, like, they are using force still to bring it about because I guess they're villains. But I think the arguments are more compelling than just like, I know better because I'm smart, or you should bow down to me because I am more powerful than you, right? Like kneel before Zod.
Yeah.
Was a conqueror and not a politician. But parallel, Superman. Are you familiar with the Injustice line?
No. Tell me about it.
So Injustice was, I believe, originally a video game where it's just a fighting game where you can fight DC characters against each other.
Okay.
Cool concept. Then they created a comic book to parallel it that told more of the background story, which is that this is a world where Superman has gone bad.
Okay.
Or, that's the narrative, but we can question that because what happens is the Joker kills Lois, or actually tricks Superman into killing Lois, tragically, and that causes Superman to just like have a mental break and kill the Joker, and then from that point forward decide like he doesn't care about human laws anymore. It's about his laws, because human laws allowed Joker to kill the love of his life. So him and Batman face off on this because Batman still is Mr. No Kill. Like, you can't kill people.
Right.
And Superman's like, why not? If you had just killed the Joker earlier in your battles, this never would have happened. He never would have killed Lois. So
That's quite a flip, given that Batman's whole thing is that the law is that Batman generally is the vigilante. He's the one willing to say the law is not working, so I'm going to go outside the law.
Yeah. Well, he still is. So Superman becomes the law. He conquers planet Earth, and various members of the Justice League, based on their personalities and background, side with him. And so it causes this break in the Justice League. And similar to the Marvel Civil War storylines, they start recruiting villains to their side. Both sides have villains that are sympathetic to their cause. So the aforementioned Sinestro, for example, sides with Superman because, that's what he's all about in the first place, is using your power to impose, order, in essence, over people's freedom.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely see where you're going there. You have the different categories. And I think that because I almost think that almost any of those categories could wind up being virtuous or not, depending on where you come at it. Was there any more categories, or is that the full list? That's
the 4 I came up with, and I think as a spectrum, the higher you go from where we started, the more it opens up these questions of well, maybe I guess the killer would be lower than the criminal technically, but it's that's kind of where I came at this subject from.
Nice. No, I can definitely see that. I think you're right. I feel like any of them, I think I can find some instance of a person who is, I think of as heroic, or at least not necessarily a villain or an ethical villain, at least in any of the categories. But the higher you go on that list, certainly the more it changes. Let me start by just kind of framing it this way. Also, to your mind, what's the difference between a villain and an antagonist?
Whether I like them or not, I don't know.
I can see that. I guess I ask it because it's, to me, I often think in a lot of movies I see an antagonist as someone who is, they're getting in the way of our heroes, what the hero wants to do, but they're not necessarily bad by any means. I wouldn't one of my favorite examples is in the movie The Fugitive, or the TV show also, but the movie from, I guess it's really a lot older than I think it is, with Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones.
30 years old.
Yeah. Well, okay, but you can find other examples like this. Our hero is a person who's been framed for a crime and is trying to both escape the cops and find justice by figuring out who actually killed his wife. And Tommy Lee Jones is playing the cop who's chasing him throughout the whole movie, the marshal, I guess.
Yeah.
And I really like the way it's portrayed because Tommy Lee Jones is shown as someone who, it's not that he's a corrupt cop who knows what's happening. It's not that he's he hates Harrison Ford's character by any means. It's just his job is to bring in the person who's run away. And he's certainly open to the idea that the person should get a fair trial, but he's you were convicted by the law. I'm going to try and hunt you down. And, there's one famous point in the movie where Harrison Ford says, "I don't kill my wife," and the cop Tommy Lee Jones says, "I don't care."
Yeah.
And I think we can look at that and say a whole lot about, can anyone who's a cop and an authority figure and not questioning it ever be considered not a villain? I think that's a whole other question. But to me, that's kind of an example, similarly, in the movie V for Vendetta, the cop figure who winds up kind of switching sides. I guess those are people I think of as not that's kind of where I draw the line of villain versus antagonist. Of antagonist is someone who's kind of getting in the way of what the hero's trying to do, but you don't look at them and think they're a bad person for it. You just think they either have different information or they're on the different side of something.
Well, essentially, that the system is corrupt or the system is wrong.
Right.
But you're not blaming the individuals who are upholding the system.
Right.
And you talked about our modern take on police officers. And I take that take. I think police officers in our society, by and large, are good people. And they are trying to do their best in a system that is broken.
Right. And it's one that really gets into the question of, does ignorance mean villainy? If you are, I guess to take the two examples I just gave, the cop in The Fugitive versus the cop in V for Vendetta, in the world of The Fugitive, at least, it seems to be a perfectly well-functioning justice system where there's also, this one person got framed. V for Vendetta, I think it's a lot clearer that the system is teetering on the edge, if not all the way over into the edge of, not being a just system at all. And so I think I hold that cop as having kind of a higher responsibility to realize that. But in both cases, you're right. It's someone who is trying to do good within a broken system.
And I think like there are different levels of whether the systems are working. And in something like V for Vendetta, the people at the top, the politicians at the top, probably still believe that their system is working because it is keeping down like general crime.
Right.
Right? Like in a totalitarian system, in theory, like you are cutting down on the average crime, like murderers and whatnot. Because simply put, like the people don't have the power to commit them. Like in a totalitarian system, you're going to take away their freedom to buy guns, for example. So you're not going to be able to shoot people.
Yeah, and it's, I think different, like, and that's always also an interesting question as well of the leader who honestly believes that as the dictator he's trying to do the right thing and trying to help everybody, even if we see it quite differently. V for Vendetta, if I remember correctly, there's some of that, but it's much more about the racism and hate, but also just the pure opportunism and an attempt to kind of empower themselves and get rich themselves.
Right. I was gonna get to that, like the greed, right? Like,
right, yeah.
Because I am doing this for society, I deserve a palace and a boat and whatnot.
Yeah, the first among equals. And I guess that I think we're on the same answer to this, but I think it's important to kind of put this question out there. Is it fair to say that both of what we're saying is that acts that would seem villainous under other circumstances can appear to be a lot more ethical or a lot more understandable depending on the cause, depending on the motivation? And that if you're that if you're attempting to run the society because you honestly believe the society is better off that way, that's problematic, but still maybe not quite that we judge that differently than someone who's just out for power and greed and control. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. And I think you'll get different perspectives on that in our modern world, depending on what country you're from.
Right.
I think that the United States of America is a country built upon and that highly values individual freedoms far more than other countries do.
Yeah. Well, I thought you were going to go a very different direction, which is that I think that's true. I also think, though, that as Americans, because of our colonial history, we're a lot more likely to believe that we need to rule these other people for their own good, And hopefully that idea is getting pushed. It's getting pushed out of the American zeitgeist, but I think it's definitely still very much there. So and let's contrast that with the victim with the villain with a cause as opposed to the mustache twirler, and we started to get into Palpatine as a perfect example of this. What do you have? What's the I think we can both say it pretty clearly, but for you, what's the problem with someone like Palpatine as a villain?
Why is he doing it?
Yeah.
Why does he conquer the galaxy? Do you know?
Because I mean, if you just watch the movies and the TV shows, you have no idea whatsoever. If you read the books, there's at least some idea given to the Sith have this ideology that they need to have control, but it's still basically just a manifestation of mustache twirling. And Jonah Kellman is listening to this and already angrily writing an email to correct me, I'm sure. But because I think the Sith do have some level of, if I have total control, then no one else can control me.
Right. So part of it is the Sith history, Sith versus Jedi history. There's like a 1,000-year-old feud between these factions, and he is partly trying to take over the galaxy to wipe out the Jedi. Right? Then the other part of it is, when he's lightning bolting Mace Windu, he shouts, "Unlimited power!" And it just seems like that's his motivation. It's just like he wants power for the sake of power.
Yeah.
At least when Anakin turns to the dark side and becomes Vader, he has that speech to Obi-Wan, right? Like, or maybe to Padme or both, where he's talking about, "I have brought peace to my empire." And so he's like fixated on the idea of peace, which becomes ridiculous because the current conflict between the Republic and the Separatists was completely manufactured by Palpatine.
Yeah. So
in fact, like, as soon as he becomes Emperor, he just says, "All right, Separatists, you're done. Thanks."
Right.
And he basically turns them off, and now you have peace. I was going to say, because there was actually no conflict in the first place. Or maybe there was, but it was not to the point of military conflict.
Right. And I do think that Star Wars illustrates an interesting point, which is this idea of that once you start telling yourself it's okay that I'm breaking these legal or moral laws because I'm doing this for a good cause, that idea itself can corrupt you, and that you can be driven further and further down the path of, I need to have even more power because of, my ultimate goal of helping everyone. And that over time, you start to forget what the ultimate goal is, and it just becomes about the power and greed. And I certainly think that is a path that where, how an ethical villain can become a mustache twirler of sorts. I think that where what I think you're getting at with Palpatine, and especially with for me the idea of mustache twirler, is where either they never had that motivation to begin with, or they're now so far beyond it that they're now just taking joy in it. Like you said, the ultimate power, the evil laugh. Those can be fun villains sometimes, but generally to me that's nowhere near as compelling a story as, even like you said, someone like Anakin, for whom it's I have to save my wife,
Mm-hmm.
or someone like Iceman is in the DC Comics, Batman comics world, is Mr. Freeze. I'm sorry, not Iceman. Wow, I'm angering people today. But that's another example of that. I need to save this person, or I need to, from Magneto, I need to save my people, or something like that.
Well, let's sticking with Star Wars. Here's an even more interesting thing. Like, when we get to Return of the Jedi, or like, let's say you time travel to just before watching Return of the Jedi, and you ask yourself, like, is there any question of who, this is the last in the trilogy, is there any question of who's going to win? And, what do you think, Luke will turn to the dark side or not? Right? Like, no.
Yeah.
Because it's very clear cut where the lines of good and evil were.
Right.
And who's going to do what. Now, go back. I mean, you had a whole episode on this, and we had discussions about this. Go back to just before you saw the rise of Skywalker. Did you have questions of who was going to win between, like Rey and Kylo Ren, and who was going to turn to the light or the dark? All over the place. We had no idea. We had debates about it, and we all had our own pet theories.
Yeah.
So for me, like, that type of villainy of Kylo Ren, even though like he did some monstrous things, he was still, you understood enough of him and his motivations and who he was as a character to make him interesting. And that for me, like, that's what I like to see, is villains who are interesting enough that you don't automatically think they're going to lose.
Right. I get that. And I think I was, well, granted I was 7, but I was maybe, I was not really sure what was going to happen in Return of the Jedi, but certainly I'm not quite with you on Kylo. I've never liked the character as much as I know you do, but I would, the one that I would put in there, that discussion as well, is for me, Darth Vader. Because Darth Vader is very much someone who, in the first movie, is, if his robot, if his face mask had a mustache, he'd be twirling it. He is just pure villainy for the sake of villainy, but in a way that is scary and intimidating rather than, humorous and eye-rolly. But But by the second movie, you start to realize, like, he has all these conflicted feelings. He doesn't really want to do what the Emperor's doing. He does maybe think that he and his son can rule the Empire and maybe do some good. You're barely there. All the way to, at the very end of Return of the Jedi, he does find some redemption by going against that.
Sure.
So yeah, I think in the Star Wars universe, you have all of that. And juxtapose that against someone like Jabba the Hutt. Jabba the Hutt, I don't think there's any possibility. He was always just that first category villain, you said, a criminal. And he's not even, like, mustache twirly. He's just, he has a little criminal empire for his own personal gain, and that's what he's out to do.
Yeah, there's no interesting Jabba stories, are there, that I'm aware of?
No, because I don't think there's much of a... He's kind of a one-note character in that regard.
Yeah.
He's scary and intimidating, but he's not... We have no question about Jabba's... I don't think there's anybody who says Jabba was right, in the way you could say that about almost any of the other more ethical villains we're talking about.
So your thing about Vader, one thing I want to add is that I think in episodes 4, 5, and 6, the fact that he is always still just like the dark, robotic figure makes it a harder turn, I think, for the whole redemption arc and all that. Where that's why I loved The Last Jedi so much, is that Kylo literally takes off the mask, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that was a very powerful visual cue for us that, he's not just, this evil masked figure. Like, now we're going to see his face. Now we're going to see his expressions and really get to see the conflict.
See, that's interesting, because I feel like if you watch Empire Strikes Back, the conflict in Vader is all over the place. Like, the way that he's kind of subtly resisting the Emperor. And I mean, granted, the way he shows that he's struggling and he's frustrated, when Kylo is struggling and frustrated, he bashes his, mask and lightsaber against a control panel. When Vader is frustrated and struggling, he force chokes to death his subordinates. So, yeah, we're pretty solidly on the side of villainy with Vader. But I feel like
there's some good comics, Vader comics. So there's the comic where he first learns that Luke Skywalker is the name of the pilot who blew up the first Death Star, and like makes the connection. Yeah, so he realizes that Palpatine lied to him about Padme dying and his child being unborn, and the anger manifests in him cracking the window in front of him on the starship that he's on with the Force. And it's just a very powerful, emotional scene.
Yeah,
that I think does a better job of showing what you were talking about of how he was trying to subvert the Emperor.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows more the motivation for why.
Right. And I think, and we'll get to that, because I think one of the things that becomes interesting about these characters is there a possibility for redemption with an ethical villain? So I want to go into some of the ideas that I specific questions I wanted to look at, and kind of different types of ethical villains. But first, I know one of the ones you want to keep coming back to is Sinestro, and that's I am not familiar with that particular story. So can you give us kind of a quick summary of who Sinestro is in these stories and how you see him in terms of ethical villainy?
Yeah, so this is the part where you can just speed up my voice. I start talking like this because he's my favorite comic book character. I've read so much of his stuff, and all the credit to Jeff Johns, who did most of the writing for the run of the Green Lantern comics, starting with Rebirth to the, I can't remember, Green Lantern The End, I think it was called.
Okay.
It was just an amazing arc. So Sinestro was originally Hal Jordan's partner and mentor. There are always 2 Green Lanterns per space sector. Okay. And Earth is in space sector 2814, as is Korrigar, Sinestro's homeworld. So when Sinestro's original partner, Avin Sur, dies crash landing on Earth, Hal Jordan, the Ring, selects Hal Jordan to be his successor. And then Sinestro comes and says, oh, like, you've been chosen by the Ring. Like, I'm going to teach you how to be a Green Lantern. So, in fact, originally Sinestro is a hero. He's a good guy, right? And what happens is Hal Jordan ends up going to Sinestro's planet, Korugar. And Sinestro at this point is regarded as the greatest of the Green Lanterns because of how peaceful he has kept Korugar and his space sector. And Hal Jordan discovers that it is because he is a tyrant. He has kept the peace by using the power of the ring to subjugate his people to his will, as we said. And, he's a conqueror / politician who is imposing his will upon the people to keep them from committing crimes at the cost of free will. So Hal betrays Sinestro, quote unquote betrays, and brings in the Green Lantern Corps. They take him down, strip him of his ring and his rank, and exile him to the antimatter universe, where he discovers the power of the yellow ring and uses that to become the Green Lantern's arch nemesis.
Okay.
Now, where things got most interesting for me was an arc called the Sinestro Corps War. So not only does he get a yellow ring and use it, he crafts other yellow rings and basically creates the anti-Green Lantern Corps.
Okay.
And it sets up, so there end up being 7, or more than 7, but basically 7 different rings of the, color spectrum, Roy G. Biv. And each one is powered by a different emotion, as they call it in this storyline. So green is willpower. If you have strong willpower, you can create these constructs with the ring and use them. Sinestro's color yellow is fear.
Okay.
So he literally uses fear to, control people and things.
Right.
And this has a parallel to Star Wars, right? The Death Star, they say that fear of this battle station will keep the local systems in line. So the idea that you can use fear to maintain peace and order is kind of a subject of this ethical villainy. Yeah,
I mean, because immediately I'm thinking of others who basically try to use fear to maintain, peace and goodness. And it's funny because the two examples that come to me, one I'm comfortable seeing as a villain, the other I'm not, because one of them is Punisher, who especially in the TV shows I think is shown, part of what he wants criminals to be afraid. He wants the people who've crossed him to be afraid.
Sure.
And
Batman.
Yeah, but that's the other one I was going to think of as Batman. And I don't like the idea of seeing Batman as a villain. But certainly I think there's some interpretations that absolutely could go there with him.
Well, there is one point where they try to recruit Batman to the Sinestro Corps and give him a yellow ring. And it's
really?
Actually, only the fact that he wore Hal Jordan's ring for a brief period in a story that gives him the willpower to resist the urge.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's very explicit in Batman's story, is that he's supposed to use fear. In the Christopher Nolan movies, where he's kind of trained by Ra's al Ghul, or however it's supposed to be. That idea comes very much to the fore of, there's that great joke about use theatricality, and then he took it a little more literally than was intended. But that's okay. That I see why Sinestro is one we want to talk about, and so let's please keep bringing that one up as we go through.
So the arc of the Sinestro Corps War ends with Sinestro being defeated.
Okay.
Partly because the Guardians, who control the Green Lanterns, enable the Green Lantern rings to use lethal force against the Sinestro Corps, to use their ring power to kill, which had previously been outlawed. And when he is finally defeated by Hal Jordan, he actually he smiles and he says, "But I got you to change. I got the Green Lanterns to change, and now you have more power to control and police the universe." So obviously, he probably wanted to win, but to him, this was a fine loss, in that he got the Green Lanterns to change to match more of his own philosophy.
That's really a great example. And I know when we get to the topic of redemption for a villain and what does that mean, one of the ones that specifically that I thought of was when it seems like the villain to some extent is proven right. So we'll definitely get to that. Because now I'm really interested in Sinestro. Has he been portrayed? I've seen most of the Justice League television show, the cartoon, but not for a long time. Has Sinestro been portrayed on screen in ways that you think are well done, or is it mostly just all in the comic books that the story lives?
No. So he was in the Ryan Reynolds movie as the mentor, and in the post-credit scene, I believe he discovers a yellow ring. So if there had ever been a sequel, it would have been kind of that arc where he becomes, the yellow wielder of the yellow light. And in the comics, in the cartoons, he's pretty much always portrayed as just a one of, basically like an anti-Green Lantern who uses the yellow ring in the same fashion, and is never really given the political motivations. So no, I've never enjoyed him in any of the visual or the video media.
Got it. Well, so let's start talking then. Let's diving into more about some of the things that can make a villain ethical. And there's a couple of categories I came up with that I want to kind of get your thoughts on, and see who you would put into which of these, or how ethical you think this is. The first is, and I think we've been talking about this a lot, it's where we can somewhat sympathize with the goals or the point of view of the character. The person who, like you said, like Sinestro, who fundamentally wants to make the world a better place just through these means we don't like, or a Magneto who, for pretty good reason, thinks that his people are being pushed around and oppressed, and that fighting back is the way to do so. For me, this is one that I think really draws me in, is where, when the villain gives their speech, I kind of stop and think and go, maybe there's some truth to this. What's your take on that? How important for you is it that from the villain's point of view, like that they're the ethical one?
Yeah, well, Magneto is probably one of the best popular examples of this, where he comes from a literal minority who has been oppressed, persecuted, in some cases, killed, slaughtered, and wants to achieve power in order to turn the tables. Right? Like he wants to save his people.
Right.
But at the cost of the former oppressors. And this is pretty much all of human history. Right? Like you look at Serbs and Bosnians and Croatians in the former Yugoslavia. Sunni and Shiite Muslims in the Middle East. There's always a group that is primarily in power, and then the minority group, when they come to power, they're like, all right, well, now it's your turn.
Yeah.
We're going to kill you, or we're going to oppress you.
I think that's well put. I think that's something else I think that also really goes into this, is where these are people who I can sympathize with, in part because I can see a parallel to our own world. When Killmonger, who you're right, needs some better PR, but when he talks about how the people of color of the world are oppressed and need to fight back, and that if there's someone like Wakanda that has the ability to, I mean, I'm all for him, and he, to me, and we'll get to this later, but he's very much in that same category of Sinestro, of one where by the end even the hero seems to think that Killmonger was somewhat right. It's interesting because it's I think with a lot of these it winds up coming down to the means to the end. Like I think Magneto has a better understanding than Professor X does of the way the world is going to treat mutants. I think in a lot of stories, I think the way Magneto is told, I'm not quite with him on the methodology he wants to use. And I think I would say that for a lot of these villains, where I can, I'm with you, like, up till you tell me what your secret plan is, and then I start to go, I can't quite go there. I will say that I think Magneto is probably one who comes closest to, especially because I think of Professor X as just as much of a villain. But that's a whole other can of worms.
Well, Magneto ends up convincing Cyclops.
Oh, okay, yeah.
In most of the modern X-Men storyline, Cyclops actually breaks off from the X-Men, or from Xavier's X-Men, and forms his own faction of the X-Men often aligned with Magneto.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And Scott Summers is much more villainous, I think.
Right.
In the modern X-Men. And then Wolverine ends up becoming the new leader of Xavier's X-Men in most of these storylines.
Another villain who I think of as being in this category, and here's one where I think it's more about the point of view, because it's harder for me to sympathize with their goals, but is Killmonger. Kingpin from the Daredevil TV show on Netflix, as well as the comics. Have you seen the Daredevil on Netflix?
I have not. No.
Kingpin is told in a very interesting way, because I think he's very much a criminal, and he's very much a Law and Order type.
Oh, really?
And it's his idea is that he eventually wants political power for himself, but he wants at the start at least he wants power over the criminal world, but it's because he wants to instill order. He wants to, rule things to cut out crime, accept his kind of crime, but the way his story is told is that he had a very. Do you mind being spoiled on the show a little bit?
I'm probably never going to watch it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But he is someone who had a very traumatic incident happen when he was a child, in which his father was physically abusing both his mother and himself, and potentially putting both of them in lethal danger. And as a young child, he winds up, because he's a very strong child, killing his father in an act of self-defense of himself and his mother. And the show actually does a very good job of showing this, just how mentally scarring this would be and how traumatic, but that it leads him to an idea of he is the only one who can keep the people he cares about safe, and that the only way to stop crime like that is through force. And King, I am fairly certain you could tell you could make a TV show called Marvel's Kingpin, in which he wouldn't be a hero, but he wouldn't be a villain. He'd be kind of like a Breaking Bad style anti-hero in which you were rooting for him. And to me, that's a sign of great writing, but it's also him being that perfect kind of. It's not that I think he's got a political cause I agree with, and I'm glad I've not had the experiences he had, and I think therefore I hope I'm able to see it with a little more balance. But if I put myself in his shoes, I can 100% understand why he thinks what he's doing is moral and just. And that makes such an interesting character to me.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised to hear this. I had heard not so great reviews of Daredevil, so
interesting.
Now I'm a little more intrigued.
Okay, you're talking about the TV show, not the movie, right?
Okay. The Ben Affleck movie.
Yeah, no, the Ben Affleck movie is horrible. I don't think anyone's defending that. But yeah, so to you, are there others you'd put in the same category of villains who are ethical because their cause makes sense to you?
Oh, goodness. I think we've covered most of the ones. I'm just looking through my notes real quick.
Yeah. I guess one other I would think of, who again kind of pushes this question, is Ozymandias from The Watchmen.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Actually, that's a great example.
Right. Well, because he's one who, thinks he's preventing nuclear war, and if the conceit of the story is that he does prevent nuclear war, again, it's a sort of a is he wrong? I think he is, but I think it's a really interesting question.
Right, and then Dr. Manhattan ends up agreeing with him, right?
Yeah.
And he kills Rorschach in order to keep the secret.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Ozymandias.
Yeah. And he is one where like Thanos, I disagree with his premise. I feel like he makes a logical conclusion that by doing this he will prevent war. And I'm not sure that he's right that it would prevent war, but if you told me that there was absolutely going to be a nuclear war unless Ozymandias does this, but by Ozymandias doing this, it is also 100% that there won't be war, then I'm not sure if I think he's a horrible person, but maybe it's needed. And it's one of those things where I think the movies will almost always give us an out, but I think that's what makes such an interesting question of is like, and to me, I guess it's the problem that I see in a lot of those villains is that hubris, and it's the hubris that makes him think that he's right and he should make the decision, is also the hubris that makes him think there's no other way and that this will solve everything. Go ahead.
So I have an example for you of a hero, like straight up. Have you watched Star Trek Deep Space Nine?
Yes. Okay.
So I think the episode was called what is it? Is it In the Pale Moonlight, or am I thinking of something else?
I've only seen it once and not for a long time, so I might not remember the details.
It is the episode where we're deep into like the Dominion War arc, where the Federation's fighting the Dominion. They are allied with the Klingons, and they're losing. And they decide that the only way that they can turn the tide of this war is if the Romulans, who have been neutral thus far, are brought into the war on their side.
Right.
And so Captain Sisko gets Garrick, plain simple Garrick, who's actually super spy, to help him manufacture fake evidence that the Dominion is plotting against the Romulans, to trick the Romulans into entering the war on their side. And when the fake evidence is discovered and fails, this is the famous gif, "It's a fake!"
Yeah.
When that fails, Garrick assassinates the Romulan senator, Vreenak, blows up his shuttle, but makes it look like the Dominion did it. And frames the Dominion. And that's ultimately what brings the Romulans into the war. And Sisko is left conflicted, right? Like, and Garrick's like, "This is what you wanted,
right?
I made it happen for you." And it's like, "But at what cost?" And there are many, there are many Trek fans who love this episode. It's one of my favorites. There are also many Trek fans who hate it because they think that this is the moment when Trek was ruined, because it was supposed to be this wonderful vision of the future, Gene Roddenberry's utopia. And you've corrupted it and made it as morally ambiguous as right now, as real life. Yeah. So it kind of shattered the fantasy.
I think that's a great way of putting it, because it's, and I was thinking about something similar with comic books, where I think we've seen this evolution in a lot of media where, traditionally media was told in very black and white terms, and that I use that in terms of morality, but unfortunately because of those terms are framed that way also because of the racist understanding of things. But, like the good guys are good and virtuous and the bad guys are mustache twirlers. And, like do you know about the comics code?
Yes.
Yeah. In the comics code, it was made very clear. This is a thing, sort of a set of moral standards to that comic books were supposed to follow for a lot of the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, where it started to get broken. But one of the things was that the villains were never supposed to have, like, their point of view. It was supposed to they was just be, villainous. And I think Roddenberry was very much of that same idea. He wanted, our heroes to clearly be good and bad. And to me, I think that you're right. I remember that episode and how much I liked it, because moral grayness is real. And part of the connection that I made there is that I think we're talking a lot about how, like, what starts to turn you into a villain is when you start to think that I can do this morally wrong thing in order to justify this cause. And what I think you're getting at with Sisko is that's not a bright line. And that for a lot of characters, like, where are they a hero and how do they become a villain? There's a huge amount of gray area there. And that I imagine there's a lot of characters who I might say I still think they're a hero even though they did this. And someone else might say, nah, they crossed this line and they're a villain. And I think I love the stories that really push on this, because it gets into, like, the line between a hero and villain is pretty gray when they're well told.
Sisko is obviously the hero.
Right.
But he embarks on this morally ambiguous path and does very questionable things. Ultimately, Garrick is the one who carries out the assassination, but Sisko doesn't turn him in. Yeah. Right? He kind of goes with the ends justify the means, and just kind of sweeps it under the rug and deletes his log entries on it. And it's complicated because I think that episode did a good job by using Garrick in that way to keep Sisko at least that one final step removed from villainy. I think if he had carried out the assassination, then it would have been much more difficult to continue to root for him as a hero.
Right.
And Garrick was just kind of morally ambiguous enough that you were okay with him doing this.
Yeah. But I think, and like I think Star Trek never went quite this far. If the next season, or maybe 2 seasons down the road, a similar situation had been set up, and now it would have to be Sisko actually doing the assassination. Like, I feel like before that episode, I wouldn't have believed it, but now I would believe that he'd at least be tempted, because I think that's to me what's the most insidious thing, is that, like I said before, once you justify one act, the next one becomes a little, it's like, if you can justify an act that's a number 1 on the scale of villainy, this was a ridiculous concept, but just to play this out, then justifying a 2 becomes a little easier, and a 3 and a 4. And I think that's I think one of the most interesting kind of story is when not the person who holds himself to a 0, but the person who does start to do things like what Sisko did, but still is able to hold a line for himself somehow.
Yeah. I think going back to like the example from Injustice, it's a similar thing where Superman killing the Joker is something you'd be like, okay, like I'm okay with that. Like I might be personally against killing, but I understand the logic of eliminating this psychopathic killer.
Right.
But then, that makes it easier for him to take the next step, which is that he's going to take over and prevent all crime.
Yeah, and that's to me, it's the way I've always understood Batman's setting that no killing line. Is he knows that's what his danger is, and so he's so willing to kind of set that line, because then he knows he's got some hard and fast line that's his definition of when it stops being morally gray and becomes actually across the line. There's one other. I think we've been going really long because it's a great discussion. So I'm kind of throwing out some of our outline, but just to hit the topics I want to make sure we talk about. There's one other kind of character I think that I want to put in here. That's again about the victim, the villain's point of view, and it's probably to my favorite character in comic books, certainly in DC and DC on screen, which is Amanda Waller. And to me, she's the embodiment of the character who is afraid of our heroes and wants to limit the power of our heroes because she's wondering what could happen if our heroes turn bad. For those who don't know her character too well, the only time she's really appeared on screen in movies is Suicide Squad, and it's a terrible movie, but I think she's actually portrayed very well.
Yeah.
But the idea...
Well, I mean, what is the actress's name? Is it Viola Davis? Or
she's an amazing actress.
Yeah.
Who's... looking that up now. Suicide Squad, Amanda Waller. The actress is Angela Bassett. Is that right? No, that doesn't look right. I'll look it up. Viola. No, you're right. Viola Davis. Really good actress. And the voice actress who plays her in the Justice League shows is also very good, and she's a great portrayal.
I liked the portrayal in the cartoon much better. Personally.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, and in both, I think, and especially in the cartoon, the idea that you get of her is she is someone who has recognized that all of a sudden there's these incredibly much more powerful things that all of which could destroy humanity at a heartbeat, and she's utterly terrified, and so she wants to be as hard as nails as she can be to protect humanity. And so the two things that she's often most doing is A, kind of like in a real no mercy kind of way, forcing super villains who she's captured to do things, in order, like she directs the Suicide Squad. But even more so, and especially in the comics, is that she wants to put in limitations. She wants to make sure that we have green kryptonite on hand in case Superman goes bad. She wants to make sure that we have a way to blow up the Justice League station in space. And she's always portrayed as a villain, or at least as an antagonist. And I often always wind up feeling like we are asked as the audience to trust these people because we're heroes. but I get why she doesn't trust them, and I get why she's therefore takes the action she does. What's your take on her character and this type of character, this type of villain?
Yeah, Amanda Waller is interesting because depending on where the storyline is going, she would be equally as comfortable collaborating with Batman as she would be Lex Luthor.
Yeah.
Because they all have similarly... They can have similarly aligned motivations.
Right.
I think, Lex Luthor fits much more into the side of we can't trust these superpowered beings, especially Superman. Like he has his motivations, when he's President Luthor, are very focused on a kind of human-centric, I guess almost human supremacist point of view that, you can't trust aliens, quote unquote, which obviously has real life parallels. But at the same time, Amanda Waller has plenty of scenes where she's collaborating with Batman.
Right. And because Batman also, Batman wants green kryptonite just as much. He also doesn't trust anybody.
Oh yeah.
And I think Amanda Waller and Lex Luthor are an interesting parallel because, actually, I should say about Lex Luthor, he has been a character for so long and written in so many different ways that you probably could fit a version of him into almost every category we've come up with. He's been just the criminal, he's been just the mustache twirler. But I think in some of the most recent tellings in comic books and in the Justice League TV shows and some of the movies, he is portrayed, you're right, as kind of human supremacist and human protectionist. I feel like, though, that he's a lot more out for his own self-aggrandizement and either financial reward or, personal power than Amanda. Amanda strikes me as someone who, she doesn't want to get rich. She doesn't care if she's in the shadows and no one knows what she does. She just wants to get the job done. Whereas Luthor, his own ego and his own hubris and his own desire to be seen as the one fixing everything also plays a huge part in it. Do you think that's a fair distinction between the two?
Yeah, ultimately, Luthor is all ego. In fact, so when the 7 different colored Lantern Corps started recruiting mainstream characters, Luthor was recruited into the Orange Lantern Corps, which was avarice or greed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very fitting. I think that's why, to me, Luthor is an interesting villain who can sometimes be a bit ethical, but I don't put him in the ethical villain category the way I very much would in Amanda Waller.
Yeah. It's funny, there are some storylines where he teams up with the heroes.
Right.
And seems more heroic. But ultimately, I think Luthor would be a hero if people adored him for it. Yeah. I guess.
I think he's very much in that intellectual fascist idea as well.
Yeah.
He in a lot of ways, Luthor and Ozymandias seem very similar to me. In that they're both convinced what they're doing is right, and that the idea that they would ever stop and think, is the harm I'm causing worth it, is just outside. They think that they're so smart that no one would ever have to question that.
Yeah.
So let's turn to this idea that we've been dancing around a bit. What is the possibility for redemption for villains like this? And first of all, is that even a topic that makes sense? It feels to me like in a lot of these stories, if they're an ethical villain, at the end they get some kind of an ending in which they get to either turn to the light or they do something good, or at least they recognize that they were wrong. Is that to you an important part of an ethical villain's story arc?
Yeah, absolutely. The end of Jeff Johns' Green Lantern run. The final villain is the first Lantern. He's kind of the progenitor of all of this power. So he's the most powerful. He can embody all 7 lights.
Right.
And Sinestro actually, I can't remember if it's this storyline where he rejoins the Green Lanterns, maybe. But anyway, he ends up helping to defeat the first Lantern.
Okay.
So to me, what happens is these ethical villains are often antagonists, but they walk this line of you can understand their motivations, and then when a bigger evil comes along, they are able to kind of swing back and team up with the heroes against the bigger evil because it's a different type of evil. I think the First Lantern just wanted to like destroy existence or something
right
ludicrous like that, and obviously you can't have that if you want to control existence.
Right. I mean, and certainly there's a number of X-Men stories. Days of Future Past is one of the best examples, but there's others where some other, bigger threat comes along and Magneto and Professor X have to unify to some extent, or, kind of realize like the particular thing that they're doing is not as important as the larger threat they're now facing.
Yeah. So I think, and yeah, like the First Lantern was just kind of a MacGuffin, right? Like a plot device, like this galaxy destroying entity, like Galactus type of thing. And I think those types of villains or antagonists are, in the context of this discussion, are not interesting. And the best thing that they can do is to realign our ethical villains with the heroes in some sense.
Yeah, it is. I think in some ways that's why this is the redemption story I'm often least interested in, because there's a sort of sense of, for an ethical villain to switch sides, now a real mustache twirler has to come along. Yeah. It can't be another ethical villain who kind of makes them question it. But I think it's a good category, and I think Darth Vader is another one we could easily put in that idea of who changes sides. I know,
or Kylo Ren, right? Like they just literally brought back Palpatine because they needed him to like cackle.
Yeah.
Some more.
Yeah, and I think that's another category we talked about, which is similar, but I think a little bit different, of the villain who makes the noble sacrifice. And I know Kylo Ren dying, I think, is something you were a lot more unhappy about than a lot of the rest of us. Am I wrong on that?
I was unhappy that he died. I was even more unhappy that they kissed.
Yeah, I think that's
I was rooting for some kind of connection between them, but the way that scene played out was not satisfying to me.
I can see that.
It could have been better.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you and I are on very different sides on the Kyrie, or what's the Raylo idea.
Hashtag Raylo.
But that we both found it dissatisfying. And I think for me, like, I don't generally love the idea of the, that like, if you die doing something noble, it forgives everything else you did. But I do think that in some stories, for me, when the villain does die in a, attempting to kind of make things right way, to me that is an interesting kind of redemption, because it's more than anything, it's a recognition of their own villainy. I think that's with a lot of the characters we're talking about, one of the things that I think makes them a villain is that they don't see the damage that they're causing. They don't see how far into that gray they've gotten. And so I think for me, the redemption is often tied to, they have that, awareness moment. They have that light bulb moment of, wait a minute, I've gone too far. I need to do something to make this right.
Yeah. The what have I done moment.
Right. And I think definitely, both Ben, and that's, I hadn't made that connection before, but yeah, that like both Ben and Anakin both have that moment. And you put it down, Vegeta from DBZ, who I believe that's Dragon Ball Z?
Vegeta, okay. Yeah, so actually Dragon Ball is famous for rivals becoming allies.
Okay.
Like, and sometimes like straight up just evil villains. Piccolo is another character who is pretty much like the embodiment of evil. So there's another character who is just God, or Kami, who in order to become God over planet Earth had to expel the evil from his body. Okay. And that becomes the character Piccolo. So he is in fact just evil. But he fights the main character Goku, and they have like they end up having a friendly rivalry where they're trying to kill each other. But then when the bigger evil comes along, they have to team up. And this happens like 2 or 3 times over the course of Dragon Ball, where the former rival now, like, there's a greater threat, so you have to team up. And Vegeta is like the ultimate character of that, even though Piccolo was literally evil. Vegeta is the one that people really love the most, I think.
Nice.
In terms of this villain turned reluctant ally.
Yeah.
And he has a great arc in this, the redemption arc, where they are fighting against a creature named Majin Buu, who is also like this kind of embodiment of evil, I guess. I don't know. And at this point, he's settled down. He's married one of the other characters in the core group, and he's settled down as just like the grumpy rival at this point. But when Boo comes along, he sees an opportunity to become more powerful than Goku, the main character, by embracing evil again. Basically, like getting a power up by embracing evil, and does so, and fights against Goku, but has that moment of like, what have I done? And sacrifices himself to try to destroy Boo, but fails. And it's a very, for anime fans, I think it's a very emotional moment when he does that.
I can see that, yeah.
So it's similar to the Darth Vader ending, I think, is like trying to take down the greater evil, sacrificing yourself.
Well, and I think it all speaks to this idea of the moral grayness at work here, and that the line between villain and hero is not a hard and fast one. But also, I think the reason why that redemption stories speak to us is when it reminds us that you can go back. You know, that it's not just I feel like one of the initial conceits of the Yoda character, of the Jedi in Star Wars, is that it's a one-way trip. You know, that you can only go, that as you start committing more and more morally villainous acts, that there's no turning back. And I feel like that the redemption story is really an idea of, it doesn't have to be that. You know, that you can, it might not, you know, redeem all the things you've done, but you can pull yourself back. You can realize what you've been doing and try to change. Which I think makes a really powerful story and a really powerful lesson for us. That it's, because I think both in stories but also in real life, it's very easy to sort of say, oh, this person did this terrible thing, let's just write them off. They're a terrible person and there's nothing more to do there.
Yeah, I mean, I think as human beings, we have all done or said things that we regret, right? Like we have all been the villain at moments in our life, and we don't want to be defined by that. We want to believe that we can learn from our mistakes and be better and improve and not commit the same wrongs going forward.
Yeah, and there's a lot of lessons there for sure, of like how, because I think that's the thing is, like, I mean, you and I, this is putting it in a very different context, but you and I have talked about this a lot in terms of I've never been in a physical situation where I had to decide, like, how much did I want to do in terms of physical violence to someone. But I've certainly been in situations where I have to wonder, okay, I'm in this heated Facebook debate, and how far into things that I think might be effective but aren't things that I feel morally great about do I want to go? And I know you and I have talked about how we have somewhat different standards about, the ways of activism and things like that. And I think it's one of the ways in which these stories are so powerful, because it more than anything, I feel like what I'm kind of getting out of this discussion is that at the end of the day, what comes down to who is a villain and who is not in a particular story is, what does the writer think the line is about who is a villain and who is not? Because the characters that I'm always interested in are these ones who, with a different writer or a different director, maybe you'd see them as not villainous, or you would see a hero. Like, to me, The Punisher, I watched The Punisher TV show on Netflix, and I 100% think he's a villain. He's a villain I understand, and I don't really agree with, but I can sympathize with, but I think he's a villain. I don't think the writer thought he was a villain, but I think a different writer could have very much told that story as making him a villain. So yeah, it's interesting the directions that these all go. I wanted to get to one other category of redemption and then ask kind of a closing question that I think you'll enjoy. But we've talked about this, but I think the other category of redemption that you were talking about, Sinestro, is where the villain winds up convincing the hero of something. And the hero kind of adapts some of the villain's point of view. Why, for you, is that an important part of the redemption or the story of an ethical villain?
Well, because I think it in a sense, it means the villain was right, but that they were going about it perhaps in too extreme of a way.
Yeah, the means versus the ends.
Yeah. So I think it's not necessarily a full redemption arc, but it does make it okay for us as fans to identify with the villain and say, okay, yeah, like I wouldn't go quite that far. Like I wouldn't kill people or, like destroy things and whatnot. But I understand your goals, and the fact that now the heroes are adopting some of that means that it is, somewhat okay to be okay with that character.
It's, I think, one of my favorite parts of the Black Panther movie is that the movie ends with, Black Panther and his country adopting a lot of what Killmonger was pushing for. Doing it in more of a, we want to help the world rather than conquer the world. But it's very much...
We're not gonna hide anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, Killmonger's whole point is Wakanda has been hiding and has been isolating. And by the end of the movie, that's not happening.
Yeah. So the final thing about Sinestro that I want to bring up is after... Because the comics keep going. Like, they call the storyline Green Lantern the end, but obviously the story keeps going.
Yeah.
with different writers, different creative teams. And in the follow-up to that, Sinestro actually, ? Becomes the hero again. The Green Lantern Corps temporarily actually disappears from the galaxy, and the Sinestro Corps then takes up the mantle of the Peacekeepers. And his daughter, who is a Green Lantern, joins him, but then I think says, like, okay, like, I'm gonna help you maintain the peace, but you can't kill people anymore. I'm pretty sure. So it kind of like flipped the table of now, like, the Green Lantern morality is changing the Sinestro Corps.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So let me close this out. I would love to keep going a lot deeper, but I unfortunately have dinner plans that my partner's letting me know food is getting ready. But to draw on a shared universe you and I both enjoy, who do you think is an ethical villain in the Magic the Gathering storylines?
Well, it's not Bolas.
No, I think if dragons have mustaches, then Bolas is twirling his as fast as he possibly can.
Doesn't he have a mustache?
He might. He might. Certainly he would twirl it. But yeah, who do you think could be seen as an ethical villain?
Are there any? I mean, it's not the Eldrazi. The Eldrazi are just like literally world destroyers. Mm-hmm. Name some other villains.
Well, the Eldrazi, actually, I was kind of thinking about a little bit, because as I understand it, the Eldrazi have they have a role in the universe, which is that their role is to clean up universes that, galaxies that are planes of existence that need to be removed, and that they are and again, I haven't read this part of the story in a long time, but that they are operating under the understanding that the universes that they're trying to destroy are ones that are supposed to be destroyed, that they're wrong, and that they've in part because they've been manipulated, or part because of just false information. But that they don't see themselves as like, mwahaha, let's, destroy existence on this plane of reality. They see it as, this is our job. We are supposed to, they're kind of the
Galactus.
Yeah, or did you ever play the White Wolf werewolf game?
I did not.
So it had a really interesting kind of moral center to it, which was the idea that in nature, there are three primary forces. There is creation. There is basically creation, like, brings raw energy and life into the world, and then there is and that's called the wild, and that the weaver shapes all of energy and life into patterns to exist, and then the worm breaks those patterns down so that the energy can be reabsorbed. And in our own world, like, mushrooms and the things that, like, allow, organic matter that has died to decompose back into nutrients to go back into the soil to create new life, that's that third part of the cycle of creation. And again, readers, listeners, tell me if I'm totally wrong. I always saw the Eldrazi as kind of like that they saw themselves as, breaking down parts of reality in order to, clear out stagnation and bring more creation in the future.
All right. I thought they were just hungry.
Yeah, that's possible too. But yeah, is anyone else you'd see as a... I guess Liliana has been a villain sometimes. She's now come over more to being a hero.
So I thought a little bit more, and I have an interesting perspective.
Go for it.
The Phyrexians.
Okay.
So the
for
Phyrexians...
For those of our fans who are not Magic people, can you give us 30 seconds of who the Phyrexians are?
They are the Magic the Gathering's version of the Borg.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
They basically try to assimilate planes of existence and beings and quote-unquote complete them. Mm-hmm. Which means to like infuse them with this weird black oil and often make them more machine-like. So they are actually the Borg.
Yeah.
And so like I think, and the Borg again are similar in that they impose this order, this sense of order, with a complete lack of free will. But that means that Borg don't kill each other, and they don't commit crimes.
Right. And from their point of view, they're making the world, both the Borg and the Phyrexians are making the world a better place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good example. I don't know the Magic storyline too much, so I'm not thinking of others, but I think that there's certainly listeners, again, if you have ideas, please write in. So I want to wrap us up, but do you have any kind of final thoughts or ideas you wanted to throw into this? Things we haven't gotten to touch on yet?
No, this was a dream come true for me, Matthew.
Good.
You let me talk about Sinestro for over an hour.
Well, I'm glad.
Obviously, like I could keep on going and going, but it's I don't know. Like I really, part of it was the writing. Jeff Johns' writing. It has just a way of simplifying things. Like all this stuff about the emotional spectrum and the colors of light, just makes it real fun. I think in the same way that Magic the Gathering, the 5 colors, and identifying with something and figuring out what that is based on the definitions, it makes it easy to jump in as a fan.
Well, I will say this. I definitely want to... This was a fantastic episode. I'm really glad you brought this idea to me. I'm now interested in learning more about Sinestro, and I definitely want to have you back on for any topic. But certainly, this is long in the future, especially with what we're going through now. But my understanding is that DC did announce that they want to do a Green Lantern movie at some point in the future, and hopefully do a much better job. I'd especially love it was Jon Stewart as Green Lantern, because he's the character I really love as Green Lantern. But whoever it is, if we get that movie, and if Sinestro is the villain, and they really do a good version of it, I'll definitely want to have you back to talk about him in that movie, because the way you describe it, this is a character I'd love to see on screen.
As a fan of the comic, the Ryan Reynolds movie was really disappointing. For example, like the villain in that movie, Parallax, was just like a cloud.
Yeah, it was so badly done.
In the comics, Parallax is the embodiment of Sinestro's power, fear. And it's very interesting because it can infect people and kind of turn them.
Right.
And he takes over them. So there's a storyline where Green Lantern actually becomes evil. This was long before all the Jeff Johns stuff, but Green Lantern becomes infected by Parallax. So he calls himself Parallax and tries to basically impose, his will,
right,
as we've been talking about, to maintain peace. This is after the Death of Superman storyline, because I don't know if you know or recall, but in that Coast City, Green Lantern's home city, is destroyed.
Oh wow! Okay.
In a nuclear explosion. And Green Lantern was not on Earth at the time. He comes back. He blames himself. He blames everyone else. He says, "Why didn't you stop this?" And he basically tries to take all of the Green Lantern power into himself.
Oh wow!
To become the ultimate power, to basically never again type of thing. And calls himself Parallax. But it turns out it's a retcon. But it turns out that he was infected by this entity of fear.
Nice.
And it was his fear of losing his family and his city and not letting that ever happen again that allowed this parasite to infect him.
Well, if nothing else, this gets me thinking that actually I know the topic I want to bring you back for, which will definitely be a chance to discuss Sinestro and a lot of other things, which is fear, specifically, as a motivation. Because it's, honestly, it's the thing that I think I've always liked about the Star Wars story most is, as someone who's both studied politics, but also a lot of like personal psychology and stuff like that, fear is one of the most destructive human feelings, whether it's, fear that your wife is cheating on you and the sort of the ways that fear kind of makes you treat her, to fear of the immigrant and fear of loss or any of that kind of stuff. Like, and I'm really interested in how many of our villains are motivated by fear, and how many just fear as a storytelling technique. So that I think would be a great thing to bring you back on to discuss.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Well, thank you, Riki. This has been a great conversation, and I'm so glad you brought up this topic. And to all of our listeners, thank you for listening, but really we'd love to make you a part of the conversation too. Who is your favorite villain? Who's the villain who makes you think, you know what, that person might have a point. Maybe I'm kind of sort of rooting for them. Who's the ethical villain that you kind of really love and want to talk about? You can let us know on Twitter or on Facebook at Superhero Ethics. We have a Superhero Ethics page, but the best place especially is our Superhero Ethics Facebook group. You have to ask to join, but you will definitely be invited. You definitely be accepted in, and we really want to keep these conversations going. So that not just that you're hearing this once a week, but jump in. Tell us about your favorite supervillain. Tell us who you believe in. Tell us what you thought of what we had to say, what you do or don't agree with. You can find us in all those places. You can also email us, superheroethics@gmail.com. So on behalf of Riki and myself, thank you all for listening. Have a great day.